And I think we're live. So, hello everybody, and welcome to the 2021 LitCon Mystery and Thrillers panel on So You've Got a Thrilling Idea, What's Next? My name is Graham Stanley, and I'll be facilitating this panel discussion. We'll be discussing how you take an idea for a thriller or mystery, novel or story, and turn it into a book. How does an author go from a first idea and turn it into a finished novel? As well as the questions I'll be posing to the panel, I would like to encourage audience members, anyone watching live, to write your own questions in the chat that I can put to the writers that are participating today. So first of all, I would like to introduce those writers who have been invited to answer the questions today. Kathleen Walls is the author of a number of mystery and other books. Her most recent book is entitled Missing, Gone But Not Forgotten, a fictionalized version of a true abduction that occurred near her home in Florida in 2009 and has never been solved. Kathleen has also written The Tenant from Hell and Double Duplicity, part of the Rialto Mystery Series. All are published by Global Authors Publications, and Kathleen is the publisher co-owner of GAP. Last Step was made into a movie by Forbes Productions, and she's currently working on the third in the Rialto Mystery Series, and you can find out more by visiting her website at kathywalls.com. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Great to have you here, Kathleen. Tom Fowler is a mystery and thriller writer who was born and raised in Baltimore, and even though he now lives in the DC suburbs of Maryland, still considers Baltimore his home. His full-time job is in the field of computer security. From a young age, Tom wanted to write, even writing murder mystery in which no one died. In the intervening years, Tom has gotten over this problem with killing characters in his stories. And Tom's first series of books focuses on an unconventional private investigator, C.T. Ferguson, and his other series stars former Special Operations soldier John Tyler, who can never quite settle into a career as a classic car mechanic. Tom's stories feature flawed heroes, action, and plenty of snark. He's also a proud indie author who learned a lot from smart people and is happy to pay it forward. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
And our third panel member is Leo Borstinski. Sorry, Leo. Leo is based in the UK and has written the Lagotti family series and is about to publish book 5 of 7 in the Alex Cohen Jewish Mafia series, as well as 2 standalone novels and some short stories. He focuses on historical crime thrillers set in the 1910 to 1950s mainly. He used to be a pantser and is now self-identifying as a plotter. Leo is a member of the Alliance of Independent Authors and holds a degree in philosophy, which he tries not to drop. You can find out more about Leo at leob.ws. Hello, Leo.
Thanks very much indeed for inviting me. Appreciate it.
So, everyone, I'm going to start with Kathleen and then move on to everyone else. Kathleen, could you tell us about the first novel you wrote? What was the initial idea? How long did it take you to turn it into a book? And finally, what would you do differently now if you had the chance?
First one was Last Step. And I've had, as I think most people, contact with family members with a drug problem. And that was my inspiration for the book. And since I live close to Jacksonville, it's the nearest big city, and Jacksonville is just, especially then, exploding with crack cocaine problems, I began working on Last Step, where the mother is a realtor, which was one of my many jobs in life before I started writing. The mother is a realtor in a little neighboring St. Augustine, and her daughter, she is trying to help her get past this drug problem and get help. And the daughter's saying, yes, I want help and I'm coming, but my boyfriend, I want to bring him back too. And meantime, the young girl, Karen, is found dead on the rooftop of this really roach hotel, which I based on a real life place that I knew of in Jacksonville that was a haven for drug people. Jacksonville, of course, is swarming with all these drug things. So I have two detectives, an African-American and a white one, working together. They work beautifully together. And each one has skills that complement the other. And when the body is found, they see a few clues that tell them that this wasn't just an overdose, but their commander and their police chief tells them, enough time on that one, just, close it out, and just one more dead druggie. Well, the mother decides at that point she can't take it anymore. She goes to Jacksonville, tries to talk to the police, and they wanted to stay out of it because they're afraid she'll get killed. But she tells them she's going to go into it and she's going to pretend to be, a different name and try to find out what had happened to her daughter. And the novel works from there. And it has a very tricky surprise ending that no one's expecting. I've fooled most people with the ending.
For us.
I do give them clues. There's always the clues in there that should let them, when they get to the end, okay, I can see why that's the guy. But it's a bit gritty. I've had some criticism for my language. My novels, all of them, I tend to use dialogue, and I tend to use the language and the words as that person would say. A drug dealer approaching someone in Jacksonville would not go up and say, "Excuse me, man, would you care to buy some crack?" They would say it slightly differently. And I got a bit of criticism for that, but to me, that was what he would have said. So that's the way I phrased it. And the lifestyle of these young women that's put themselves in this spot is not pretty. And again, that gets kind of gritty. And how it got picked up into a movie is a small company, Forbes Productions. And I also write a lot of historical fiction, and I was doing some of that and selling it at reenactments, Civil War reenactments. And I met Chris Forbes, who was the head of the company, and he got interested in the book and picked it up and did a movie. It never went anywhere, never made the hits, but it was fun doing. I got to play a part of my real estate broker, little tiny part, not the mother, the main character, but her broker in St. Augustine. But it was a fun ride, and I've moved from there now.
Hold on. I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you there, Kathleen, because otherwise we'll. I think the idea is let's talk about everyone's first book.
Okay,
and then we'll move on to how you developed. I think it'd be interesting to compare each of you as writers, how you got started, and then we can move on to how your career has developed since then as a writer. So I'm going to move to Tom now. So Tom, the same questions really. How did you get started? What was the first novel you wrote? The initial idea for it? Did it take you a long time to turn it into a book? And then finally, I think, what would be interesting for new writers is, would you do it differently now? How have things changed maybe?
I would do it a lot differently. It probably took me, this is for my first mystery novel that I published in the fall of 2017. It probably took me about 6 years from writing chapter 1 to thinking it was good enough after running it through an editor and all that to actually putting it out into the world. And a few stops and starts, a few, is this really, let me give it its 19th read over to polish it again. But it's a little bit different. I've been reading a lot of mysteries and thrillers, and I wanted to write one, but I didn't want to write the same kinds of characters that I read about in books or saw on TV. I didn't want to write the grizzled ex-cop. I love Spencer and characters like that, but I wanted to do it differently. I didn't want to go the photographic memory route with someone like Monk or The Mentalist. Again, good shows, but I wanted to do it differently. So I focused on someone who kind of came to the career through being a hacker, and because my job is in IT security, and it chronicles the first book chronicles his first case. So we don't meet him as a fully formed detective. He's still figuring a lot of this out, as I was as a writer too. And the biggest thing I think I would do differently now, I think you read in Leo's introduction that he was a pantser and now self-identifies as a plotter. And I think I've gone down that same road. I definitely pantsed that first book. And in the third book, I wrote myself into a corner doing doing so, and I do plot things out now. I think that's the biggest thing I would do differently, is to plot it out in advance. I always know how the book is going to end when I start. Even back then, I knew how it was going to end, but there were a few detours along the way that I probably didn't need to take, if you will. So I think I could probably write a tighter story. I think I do write tighter stories now, by plotting them out in advance. And I think, like I said, I think it took about 6 years to go from, chapter 1 to putting it up on Amazon, and I've greatly streamlined that process since then.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. I think what you just described is seems to be the case for a lot of writers. When they're first starting, they take quite a long time to actually develop the idea and turn it into a novel that you're happy to either send to a publisher or self-publish, etc. Was that your experience, Leo? How did you get started?
In a way, yes. There are certainly some similarities there. My first novel that I wrote, I started when I was 21. I just left university. I was thunderingly unemployed, and probably unemployable with a philosophy degree, to be fair. And I had a lot of time. I had a lot of time on my hands, and I gave myself what would later be called a bucket list of 3 things that I was going to do, and one of them was to write a novel. So I started September when I was 21 years old. I won't work out the year because it's too much maths. And 5 years later, when I was 26, I had written 5 of the 10 chapters. And I say there were 10 chapters because that's about all I knew. I decided to split the thing into the story into 10 pieces. I knew 2 things. One, that it was going to be having a final scene with a man who's the main character, sat on the porch holding a black plastic bag filled with body parts with blood seeping out. That was the final scene. I knew that. I wrote that very early on. And the only other thing I knew about him was that he was a commuter, because when I was 21, straight out of university, my biggest dread was that I'd spend the next 30 years being a commuter, just going to an office. So that was the story. I fleshed it out over the 5 years, got about halfway through the book, till I was about 26. And then at that Christmas, I thought to myself, I can't do this forever. I just need to finish it. So I wrote 5 chapters in my 2 weeks vacation over Christmas time, because the UK, you get more than a couple of days. And I wrote my 10 chapters and shoved it in the back of a drawer going, hurrah, I've just written a novel. I told myself when I was 21 that I'd write a novel, and I did. And it took another 25 plus years before my extended family convinced me to self-publish, which I eventually did. And what I would do differently is not write it. I mean, it's utter cack. Awful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's awful. I read it every few years. I read it just to remind myself that I don't do that anymore. It was, as part of the journey to learn how to write, it was fabulous, but I would never publish it. The publisher in me would not allow it to go down under my name. And because I did no marketing with it, no one's bought it, thank goodness, because it would just be embarrassing. So I would plot it now. I often do write the last scene still, because I often have an image caused by watching too many Cagney and Bogart movies from the 1950s and 40s, I think. So I always have an image at the end of where I want to be. But now I have 1 or 2 sentences per chapter. I do plot. Basically, I was given this fabulous book, which is Christopher Booker's 7 Basic Plots. And I don't sort of live my life through it, but I have certainly distilled the essence of the key kinds of plots. So I change up the different. Sometimes I write a tragedy, sometimes I write a hero's journey. All the stories now I've worked out need to have a genre, and I am a historical fiction crime writer. That's what I do. Story about a contemporary commuter who ends up murdering someone. Great, but it's not me really. So I don't do that anymore. And I am aware of the structure of, Robert Key's 3 acts, whichever system you want, knowing an order of things and then tailoring the story around that structure works well. So the book I'm about to launch end of April, Cuban Heel, which is book 5 of Alex Cohen of the lifetime of a Jewish gangster, basically. It's set around real events that took place in Cuba in the 1950s, the price to President Batista and the Cuban Revolution and stuff that happened in between. So I've tied real events, but fundamentally I've sewn it around a classic 3-act story. And that's the biggest thing that I do differently. Actually know what I'm doing and not using too many adjectives.
Fantastic, thank you, Leah. I think there's a couple of things there where I'd like to pick up on. One of them is I'd definitely like to ask Kathleen if she's a plotter or a pantser, as you both come out as pantsers that are now plotters, which I think is an interesting thing to hear. And I wondered if Kathleen was the same. Kathleen, do you plot out your books, or do you just start writing and work out what's going to happen as you go along?
A little bit. In the beginning, I was just sort of stream of consciousness as a, because it was kind of an event that I knew was basing on something that had happened. So I was kind of restricted. But now, my newer ones, especially the Realtor series, I want to know how I'm going to end it before I start it. I get my little kernel of thought often comes from something from my real estate experience, but before I really start, I want to know where I'm going. It does change sometimes for me in the middle of that. But basically, I plot to the extent of I want to know my ending.
Great. So the important thing is to have a clear idea of how you're going to end, even if you don't know how you're going to get there. You think
it's sort of like you don't jump on a bus unless you know where the bus is going to take you. You want a destination in mind when you start.
Tom and Leo, that's definitely the way that you go now, do you think?
Yeah. I live on the East Coast. If I wanted to say drive to California, there are a lot of ways to get there. And, I consider a plot to be like a roadmap. Just because I'm supposed to stay straight on this highway doesn't mean I'm not going to get off here because there's a restaurant I like at the next exit. And I'll reroute, to use the GPS term, and I'll just rejigger the plot a little bit. I think I do a plot at the beginning. I do chapter by chapter, usually a few sentences per chapter. So there's obviously some pantsing going on because I turn 2 sentences in a scene summary into a 1,000-word scene. So there's a lot of making it up on the fly in that part. But to me, the plot is just the roadmap. And sometimes events in the story cause it to change. Sometimes the road you want to take is closed for construction, so you have to take a detour.
Of course. And another thing I'd like to pick up on is that, Leo, both you and Kathleen, I don't know about you, Tom, have said that a lot of what you write is rooted in actually history, things that have happened. So Kathleen has a mystery which is actually about an unsolved crime, and you very much situate, I think, Leo, some of your novels in real time periods. How important is it for you when you do that to get everything sort of right as far as the history is concerned?
Good question. I think the simple answer is that I try and get the main things right. So I make sure the St. Valentine's Day Massacre takes place on February the 14th. What's lovely about writing about dead people in situations where there's not absolute clarity is that often people don't really know what happened. So I'm writing a number of books which rely on certain assassinations having happened. So one of the most famous ones I wrote in my previous book was the assassination of Bugsy Siegel in Las Vegas. But no one really knows why he was assassinated. There's a whole, there are so many different opinions as to quite why. So my main character, who is fictitious, I've inserted him inside that world, and I've decided how I'd like it to be. But what I make sure is that the overall story makes sense and the key events make sense, but I can be quite relaxed. I personally am quite relaxed if, say, there are 2 real events and I swap their order. If they're not major events in anyone's lives, I'll swap them over to make more sense. Or, for example, especially when dealing with complex cases of organised crime, I whittle down the cast list There can be 10 or 15 people conspiring to perform some interstate crime. And frankly, I don't want 15 characters just to be named just so that I can be accurate historically. I'll have the one main character who I'm interested in be the perp. So again, just to flip back to earlier, it's like he said, Hustler, Al Capone is responsible for far more crimes in my books than he actually perpetuated himself. I'm not saying he was a good guy, but I mean, I've over-egged his rap sheet because we don't need to hear about the 30 other Italian gangsters based in Chicago who did bad stuff. For the purpose of my story, Chicago, bad stuff, Al Capone is all you need to know. So I'm loose with minor details or things which are going to get in the way of structuring the plot correctly. But the big stuff, the assassination of Albert Anastasio in the 50s in a barber's shop chair, that's incredibly well known, and I'm not going to move that into a circus. It's going to stay in the barber shop, and it's a great scene. I mean, it's a great scene because we know he gets murdered, we know how he gets murdered in horrendous detail because there's post-mortem details, but we don't know who done it. We still don't know who done it, which is brilliant. So my character can whip out a pistol and start shooting at mirrors. Brilliant.
Great, that's really interesting. Just before we move on from this subject, I wondered if you or any of the others, if you've ever had any readers sort of write to you and say, no, it wasn't like that. You've got all this wrong.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I'll confess early on the basis that it has happened. Happens occasionally, and they point to the little details that I don't care about. So I don't dismiss them. I always think through whether the changes I've made were relevant to my plot, relevant to my story, rather than relevant to the world. But I'd also say that I also get the odd email from readers who say, I was there, or my uncle was there, and it really rings true. And it's the ringing true that actually I'm more concerned that it feels right rather than it physically is right. Because I'm not writing a documentary, I'm not writing reportage, I'm writing a story which happens to involve dead people who can't sue me.
Yeah, that's good. In contrast to that, Kathleen, you said you have written a book about an unsolved murder that happened quite recently. I wondered if you had any feedback. That's quite a sensitive thing because I think, it's one thing writing about something that happened in the 1920s or 1950s, but so close to write about an unsolved murder, and then presumably you try and solve it. Have you had any sort of reader feedback about that? Did you have any reservations about writing about something that happened so recently?
Well, the thing is, the case was very well known public. It was Haley Cummings, the little 5-year-old girl that was abducted in Florida. I lived actually in that same county at one time, wasn't there, but I was neighboring county. She was whoever abducted or killed, I think it's pretty obvious she was dead. What I've done, like Leo, I've introduced my fictional detectives who have no connection whatsoever with real life. Everything else, all of the other detail, as much of the police reports and the crime stuff, I've put in some of it verbatim. For instance, a 911 call with a little 17-year-old girl, babysitter, girlfriend, calls the police. I put that one in verbatim as the phone call was recorded because it's public record. My detectives, towards the end of it, because the case is never solved, I can never just bring the case up and they would go be convicted. They're sitting in a restaurant after what happens in the thing eventually is that the people who pretty obviously were involved all end up, the police can't get them for the murder, but they get them for drug trafficking and things. So they're ending up 15 and 20 years in jail. So she's bemoaning my female detective, I don't feel like justice was done. The male detective is saying, well, look at it. If they got convicted of maybe manslaughter or attempted murder or abduction, they probably wouldn't have even gotten as many years as they've gotten for this. So they're kind of rehashing their opinions, which are my opinions of what happened in the case. So since nobody can prove who actually killed her, even if she was killed, the general opinion is that the babysitter, later wife of the older guy, the father of the child, ended up killing her, either probably accidentally with an overdose of drugs, and then had friends, brother, cousin, friend, drug dealer, one of them, take and dump the child in the St. Johns River. The St. Johns River is full of alligators, so no body was ever found. But as for details, I mean, some things I do like, Leo, some things differently. I focus on the details if I'm going to describe the day of the court book. Now, in some books, I do play around with my dates and change to make them fit the theme. But in that one, I pretty much keep it exactly whatever is recorded out there that really happened. But every book is different too.
Of course. I imagine there's some sort of, you have to tread carefully with something like that, I would imagine.
Well, I changed my names of it was the Cummings family. But the thing is, they can't really sue me because I'm not saying anything that they didn't publicly say or was said about them and prove it. I mean, they're all in jail right now for drug trafficking, and that was public record. I got actually one police report. They're supposed to redact the name of the undercover agent. They missed it one time. Of course, I didn't use it, but they did forget to redact that at one point in the police report. So everything comes from accurate sources. So,
of course,
if they sue me, the book will get to be a big hit. So,
great.
I'm not too
Tom, what about you? Have you ever written about real historical events in your mystery books, or have been tempted to, or would you prefer to stay completely away from that?
Well, they're all contemporary. Every now and then they are based on something that happened, but I do take some liberties with the story to fit it in where I need it to. I do write stories set in a real city, and my protagonist lives on a real street in a real Baltimore neighborhood. And I'd say probably 98% of the city is as it really is. I do fictionalize a few things. And I do get readers who email me and say, "Oh, I was in Baltimore, 20 years ago, and we went to that restaurant you talked about," and that's always gratifying to hear, But some of my stories are based on real events, real crimes that happened, but for the most part, it's just stuff that I make up.
Great. So, taking what you've just said, actually, some of the ideas you get for your stories, or everyone here. This is a question for anyone, really. How do you know that something has legs, that you think you can turn it into a long story, a novel? I'm sure. Do you normally have lots of ideas and then have to choose between them, or are there just a few ideas and you try and stick with that until it's developed? Interested to know what your process is as far as getting the idea and then turning it into something, or not.
I have an ideas book, so I've got at least a dozen to 2 dozen one-liners of ideas of things that could turn into the next book or the next series. Some of them are quite daft. So there's a story idea which will never. This is the story that will never get written that I love the most. It's about an intergalactic accountant. I have this idea for a comedy sci-fi story. Very Hitchhikers. I'm not claiming any originality here, but I love the idea of a cleric forcing a tax accountant to become president of the galaxy, and I think that should have legs. But I know that my sense of humor doesn't touch many other people's, so it's at the bottom of the list. Near at the top are a variety of news stories about mafia folk who've met horrible ends or surprising stories about them, coming out of news reports mainly. And also sometimes there's other things which are just, there's one called, it's called The Hotel, because I've got to give it a name so I can recognize it in the document. It's about three strangers who come into a hotel, and in the morning 2 of them are dead. Now, I've got some backstory on each of the 3, but I've got no idea if it would survive a serious attempt. To answer the second aspect of your question is, well, how do I know which ones to pursue? Sometimes you don't. I just think, well, let me just think about this one and see if I can come up with who's the main character. Because if you can't do that, you kind of got nothing. And I think the bottom line is that the ones that I get really excited about and come back to again and again over the course of a week or a month, those are the ones that I'm going to love. And those are the ones that I will have the energy to pursue into a full novel or ideally a full series. It's that pit of the stomach excitement.
Great, thanks, Leo. Tom, Kathleen, what about you two?
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Ladies first.
Okay. A lot of my latest series, the kernel of it starts with something that happened when I was a property manager in real estate. And then it goes wild from there. And those I can really go wild with, but I'm doing putting a lot of travel in because I'm basically a travel writer too, and I can't travel much right now. So I'm putting in, I have my character, when people are thinking maybe she did it, she goes to where the guy came from to try and find out. And I'll pick a place like in one book, The Tenant from Hell in Georgia. And since I've toured Hell in Georgia quite a lot, while she's got free time, she can't go check the nightclubs until the evening. So she can do the tourist attraction. So I'm bringing in my travel writer side with really accurate descriptions of the things to see and do when you're in Hell in Georgia. And of course, the book is The Tenant from Hell, because the guy rents to him and doesn't know where he's from. He doesn't take an application. And in real estate, I found a lot of people will rent because they like somebody. They're nice. I work with them. They know nothing. They don't do any background checks. They just rent to them. But of course, in real life, this tenant didn't get killed. I might have wanted to kill him. Several times I did want to kill him, but I didn't. And nobody killed him. He eventually moved, gave my owners an awful, terrible time because they were really nice people. But that's what happens when you get drunk with your tenants. And that part of it was my kernel. And sometimes that's the way. The other one, the drug story, Last Step, was because I just wanted to make people understand how awful drug addiction is, and that that these people aren't monsters, they're addicts, and they do horrible things because they're addicted to a horrible drug. So everything is kind of different. But the real estate series is kind of more of a fun thing. I'm having a lot of murders, but I'm having fun with it. Tom, didn't mean to jump on to you. What's your point?
Oh, no. Yeah, I write in series. I have a mystery series and a thriller series that I recently started. So I always know who the main character is. It's a matter of finding out who the villain is and giving that person proper motivation, which opposes the hero's motivation, because you have to create that conflict. And I just lost my thought there. Or what was the question again? Sorry.
From initial idea to actually deciding it's worth writing.
So when I have an idea and I've come up with like the villain and the antagonist and what that person's motivations are, I basically just sit down and do a bunch of bullet points of walking through the story. And if I can fill the page up enough, then it's probably worth a novel. If I can't, it doesn't mean I scrap it. I could turn it into a novella or a short story. Now, in mystery and thriller, I found that novellas and short stories are not big sellers, but you can always put them in an anthology. You can make a giveaway around them. You can still use the story, but it may not be something that's worth a novel. But the ones that are worth a novel, I then move into a separate file. Like Leo, I have an idea file basically, and the ones that are worth a novel, I fully plot out from my initial bullet point list, and the ones that aren't, I'll come back to when I need a novella or a short story.
Great, thank you, Tom. So another question is related to your influences. I mean, do you have any particular writers that you admire, or books that led you to think this is what I want to do? And then also, what about nowadays? Are there any contemporary mystery or thriller writers that you particularly enjoy that you'd like to suggest people read?
I'll start with Raymond Chandler. I mean, those two words to say it all for me, which is very unhelpful. His ability to say so much with so few words, that's the the element of his story writing, which I enjoyed 30 odd years ago, before I thought of that I'd be starting to write thrillers or crime genre books myself. It's amazing how the ex-journalist in him comes out. My first career was as a journalist, financial journalist. There's nothing very exciting or racy, but it did mean that in my first reporting articles, every time I had an adjective, the printout would be scrunched into a ball and thrown at me until I stopped writing adjectives into my copy. And I got to tell you that I don't have much fluff around the edges even now, when haven't been writing as a reporter for probably 25, 30 years or something horrendous like that. So I'll throw in Elmore Leonard on the basis that his little book of his little pamphlet of how to be a writer. One of the first things he says is, don't write a description unless it's important. I paraphrase. And I used to describe the little details inside a room because I liked to, but it didn't drive the plot. In fact, it didn't matter what colour the chair was. And now you're lucky to find out that there's a chair from me. I try and avoid any excessive description whatsoever. And that comes from reading Leonard's advice, but also, you know, your Chandra Dashiell Hammett type writing prose, which is so sparse. I'm definitely influenced by that, by those truly great ancient, you know, long since gone writers. But to me, they're still inspirational because I still love reading their stories.
That's interesting, Leo, because actually I can't remember now. I'll dig it out and put a link to it. But I remember reading a piece about Raymond Chandler's descriptions of furniture and rooms, actually, because they're actually quite vivid, aren't they?
Yeah,
in some of his books, and he's got quite a reputation for actually focusing a lot on that, which that kind of descriptive writing, as you say, has kind of changed, hasn't it? People are moving away from putting those details into this type of book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think part of it is that the rules for screenwriters is different. You don't create a costly set by saying they walk across a marble floor. You know, it's that kind of thing. You leave that to the filmmakers. In a similar way, I think I'm going to regret what I say almost as I say it. It's the arrival of cable and trash TV that has cheapened people's minds. This is not going to be the rant that it sounds like, but people are used to a different mode of writing now because there's so much get access to so many different kinds of plots, and you know there are whole channels aimed at either true crime or fiction crime, whereas you know back in the 50s when let's say 40s when Bogart was putting on yet another fedora and a raincoat, you listen to the radio stories and that was about all there was. I'm not saying one's better or worse. I'm just saying that the average consumer of stories is far more adept at knowing plot lines now and thinking for themselves and imagining for themselves.
Great. So what about you, Kathleen? Have you got anyone that's particularly influenced your writing, do you think, that you would like to admit to here?
I've got some really varied tastes. I love Jonathan Kellerman's stuff because of the psychological aspect of it, and I like his characters. And on the same time, I love Carl Hiaasen, mainly because I live in Florida and our environment is important to me, and it sure is to him. But I like Sue Grafton, which is this series is the first time I'm going with a first person point of view, kind of based on Sue Grafton novels and the way she went, and Janet Ivanovich. But I don't go for the comic end of it, really. Even the dark humor that Carl Hiaasen has in his books, I don't do that. I'm trying, and like David Baldosi's another one, and John Patterson. But I do go more descriptions in mind because I feel like I want to have the reader be able to see the place that they're in. And of course, being older, I'm looking at more the Humphrey Bogart end of it than the trash TV right now. I'm not a big TV fan. But I mean, he's right in that, readers' span of attention is a lot shorter. They don't want to focus on much now. They want to zoom, zoom, zoom.
Yeah, it is very interesting to see how that's changed, isn't it? Tom, has anyone in particular come to mind that has influenced the way you write? Or
Well, we've heard a few of the names already. Chandler, Leonard, Grafton. I'd say probably the biggest influence for me was probably Robert B. Parker and the Spencer series. I even remember watching the Spencer for Hire TV show in the mid 80s at my grandparents' house sometimes. You can actually track it down on DVD now, and Avery Brooks is still terrific as Hawk to this day. So he's probably the biggest influence, and he has that kind of sparse writing style. And I think I've kind of adopted that. I read a lot of fantasy years ago, and a British writer, David Gemmell, has the same kind of similar, very sparse writing style, and that's what I tend to favor. I don't do a ton of descriptions. I do a little more now. Early on in the series, in my mystery series, the main character was still kind of new to what he was doing. And I wanted to kind of portray the fact that he wasn't very observant yet, probably not as much as he should have been. And as he's grown into the job and, had a few challenges and bullets thrown his way, he's learned to observe his surroundings a little bit more. So now the challenge is to be descriptive without padding the word count.
very, very good. Yeah, that's great. I'd like to, if I may, turn now to publishing and sort of the pros and cons versus trying to get published by a mainstream traditional publisher versus small independent publishers or self-publishing, how to do it if you want to do that, paper books or ebooks. What kind of things would you recommend for authors who are starting out now? Which way to go, why, etc. So I'm opening up to the floor. Whoever wants to jump in and say what you think and why you've made the decisions you've made.
Well, I'll start if everyone's okay with that. 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago now, I queried every literary agent in the UK and Ireland who covered crime and thrillers. There were about 80 of them. I put them in a spreadsheet. And I sent out a query letter to every single one of them for a book called The Heist, which was about a robbery, funnily enough. Oh, yeah. I know, it was a shock. I know it's a shock. I shouldn't have let the cat out of the bag. And I got 79 silences or rejections. I got one agent who, after about 3 months, emailed me back saying, "That's interesting, but could you give me something else that's maybe nearer to what your background is, financial services?" So, and this is before I really understood genre, I hasten to add. So 6 months later, I wrote a book which was based on UK financial services contemporary. And within 2 days, I got a rejection from the agent because I was mixing my genres quite badly. The opening scene which relates to this couple who end up murdering and generally being unpleasant and committing a large number of criminal acts in the city of London, opens with one of the characters masturbating while watching the other one having sex. And for some reason, it took 2 days to reject that, and not the 3 months of the first book. So at this point, I thought to myself, I've spent 2 years querying, and I'm as unpublished as I was from the day when I declared my first manuscript, first proper manuscript, completed. So I need to self-publish. So I surfed the web to find out how on earth to do that. And the first thing I did was I published on Amazon an ebook version. And then later on, about 3 months later, once I've managed to fully wrap my head around what that experience meant, I then used some free software to produce a different cover, and I published a paperback version, again on Amazon only. It took me another year, 2 years to decide to go wide. By that point, I had, well, during the intervening 2 years of querying, I had a number of books completed. So my pace of writing was faster, and I had some manuscripts which I could start turning into actual books. So that was the advantage of wasting 2 years querying. But it then meant that I had a chance to make some money as well. I realized from my perspective, I could write about 3 novels a year because I'd be writing in the evenings. Amazon gave me, if I got the price point right, about 70%. Kobo, Apple, B&N get me between 60 and 70% of the cover price. Trad publishing, from what I could tell, I'd get no more than 10% if I was lucky enough to get a trad publisher to want to publish the book. And at the point when I was making the trad versus self-pub decision, there were no traditional publishers on that list. So I would have got 10% of nothing. And I then realized, using some amazing mathematical science, that 70% of even $1 was greater than 10% of absolutely chuff all. So I went self-publishing because I knew I could generate more money that way. So even on the first day, I made more money. Obviously, the costs are mine as well, and I used pre-made covers originally, not even custom covers. But after a while, started to get some momentum and started generating some income off the books, enough to be able to afford a custom cover and a professional editor, as well as a pro writing aid lifetime license. I think those are that and possibly Scrivener are my best investments in my craft and creation of my self-publishing empire.
Fantastic. That's great. Great summary of how you went about that. Tom, Kathleen, what about your experience?
For me,
I'm always butting over Tom.
it's okay.
My fault for not introducing just one of you, I think. Apologies.
It's okay. My first experience with trying to get published, I was, of course, trying for a traditional publisher back then. And it was a small publisher, traditional though. Very bad experience. She took the book. I signed a terrible contract that I found out later was awful in favor of her. Held the book up for almost a year. And this was not a mystery. This was a travel book, ghost stories. So all of the places that were in it over a year, I had to go back and check if they were still open. And I got very burnt out on traditional at that point. A group of us was pretty much an international publishing co-op where we all contributed work towards it. I ended up doing formatting and Photoshop stuff, covers and things. Other people did editing because I'm terrible with editing. And we shared. And then the Patriot Act came along, and that sort of made it difficult for people in other countries working with us. So it kind of dropped, and I took it over and did it as my own company, and it's now Global Office Publications. However, in the print end, which I love print books, I mean, people just aren't buying print books as much anymore, it seems. At least not, on the level of Olive. I mean, maybe if you're famous, they do. So now I'm doing more of the ebooks, but I have found out that I'm doing a lot better with audiobooks. I use ACX, which is Audible, which is an Amazon. And I've had pretty good results with that, but I do, keep them both ways. And I still have a stack of print books back from when I was doing the print stuff.
That's great. It's interesting to hear about that Audible audiobook increase, because it does seem to be taking off quite a lot. Tom,
the narrator is very important in that one. Getting a good narrator, listen to their voice and make sure they fit your character.
Tom, are you into audiobooks?
I've done a few. For me, it's very weird to hear someone else reading my book. I have no problem listening to other people's audiobooks. I just finished listening to, the latest Jack Reacher audiobook. But to hear someone read my own, because you write it and you kind of hear it in your head, and the narrator's voice is obviously important, but it's just like, does he inflect the sentence a different way than I heard it in my head when I wrote it? And really, an audiobook, like anything, is an adaptation. If you get a movie made from your book, it's an adaptation. It's not going to be 100% faithful because it's someone else's interpretation of it. And so I've done a few audiobooks. Audio rights and foreign translation rights are the two that I would gladly accept money for. But for the rest, I am happy to independently publish. For me, it's about control. I don't want to have to wait. Even if you get past the gatekeepers, it can take you 2 years to find an agent, and then the agent has to find a publisher, and you got double gatekeepers there. So even if you get past all of that successfully, okay, well, we'll publish your book in 18 months. Oh, and you have another one, we'll publish that the next year. Well, in 2.5 years, I can publish 8 novels. Why would I wait? I usually do 3 or 4 a year. So for me, it's about the control of the publishing schedule. I work with the editor I want to. I work with the cover designer I want to. And yeah, I get 70% most of the time versus, somewhere from 10 to 20%, depending on what format your book is in. Do you have to format your own books? Yes, but you can do it for free in many places, or you can buy software to do it easily. It helps to work with the cover designer because I think most writers probably can't design their own covers. I certainly can't. I'm a terrible artist. So yeah, there are costs involved that in a traditional model, the publisher does pay. But if you make a little bit of an investment, I think that will pay off. And there's a very good resource called Let's Get Digital by David Cochran that I think is free in ebook formats. So if
yes,
you're
it is
in self-publishing, that is a fantastic resource. He lays it all out, why you should do it, why you should consider it, the places to do it, the basic mechanics of how it's all done. It's a tremendous resource.
Yeah, David has some amazing resources.
He does.
He's got a free course as well at the moment, which is starting, how to self-publish, starting from zero, from not knowing anything, all the way through, which I can recommend as well. So that's really interesting. I think both you and Tom, you and Leo, Tom, have mentioned the importance of having an editor. And that brings me on to this idea of how do you ensure quality? Because I think one of the things that that perhaps dissuades some readers away from reading self-published books is the quality aspect, isn't it? And I think I'm new to this, but I think it does seem to be something that more and more people are self-publishing, and more writers who are self-publishing realize that you really need to get an editor involved. My feeling is that maybe even more than one editor. You might have a developmental editor go through the content and give you some hints, and then a line editor and a proofreader. Is that the case? I mean, does that ring true with what you write and what you do before you actually go through the self-publishing process? Again, I think, opening it up to the floor.
Yeah, I think quality is very important. Readers, I think they don't care where a story comes from. No one sits in their chair and says, I'm only going to read books published by Penguin Random House. Even people who retired from Penguin Random House don't say that. So readers don't really care where the story comes from. They just want to be entertained, but they also want a professional product. And yes, one of the downsides, if you will, of self-publishing is that someone could take their first draft in Microsoft Word, make a cover in 60 seconds in Paint, and throw it up in the Kindle store, because Amazon doesn't do any quality checks. Kobo doesn't really do any quality checks. It's all, it's self-policing basically. And there's something like in the US Kindle store, there's like 8 million books. And I forget the exact number. I think Dave Chesson has talked about it. But the majority of them don't even have a sales rank because no one's bought them. Even the author hasn't bought them. And, step one, buy your own book. I mean, come on, give it that first sales rank. But it's, because the cover's bad or the look inside shows that it's not edited. So I think it's very important. I do have a copy editor. My review team generally does the proofreading for me because, my editor's human too. He's going to miss a few things. And sometimes I'll introduce new mistakes when I try to implement his suggestions. And, my review team tends to pick off those. And I think I put out a pretty clean product at the end. But, it seems, I think there's this expectation that some readers have that a book has to be perfect. And it's just not going to be. I've read traditionally published books that have typos and the wrong word and things like that. And then it happens. Anything produced by people is going to be imperfect. It's inevitable. But I try to get as close as I can. I do have an editor. I do follow most of his suggestions. I do have a cover designer. I have a whole team of proofreaders, basically. And to me, it's about putting out the most professional product you can, because you want to have your book next to the traditionally published books on the shelves, because readers just want the good story.
Of course, that's very good advice. Tom, just before I move on to Leo and Kathleen, you mentioned review team. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I in my email list, when someone joins my list, they get a series of automated emails, the autoresponder sequence. And the final one in the sequence, after they've gotten the free either mystery or thriller book, depending on which one they signed up for, is an invitation to join my review team. And they get a copy of the book I distribute through BookFunnel about usually 3 to 4 weeks before the book comes out, so everyone has time to read it. And mostly what I'm looking for is, does the story work? Have I avoided all the potholes along the way between the beginning and the end? And I also say I'm happy to accept, for you to point out my keyboard misadventures that happened along the way. And so normally there's a list of, a typo here and there, the wrong word. And I fix those before I put it out. But what they also do is week 1, after the book goes live, they post reviews on Amazon, the other bookstores, Kobo, Google, Apple, Barnes & Noble, in addition to Goodreads and BookBub. And, it's pretty typical that I can end the first week with, 30 to 40 reviews. And yeah, they're usually pretty favorable, because people aren't going to sign up for the team if they don't like my stuff, I hope. But, it's a good shot in the arm to get those first few reviews. And, also they point out things that maybe don't work in the story, and also the mistakes I've made along the way at the keyboard.
Great, thank you. So moving on to Kathleen and/or Leo, whoever wants to start. What about you?
I have, with my publishing company, I end up doing the formatting and the Photoshop work and the covers. And my partner she's got a background in that. She's much better. She does the editing. And then I also have a proofreader. Where I'm lacking is, as Tom says, is reviews. I've started using BookBub, but I do need to work on getting more with the reviews. I've just recently started working on the promotional end of it. So that's a biggie for me. I need to start on that.
Do you have a newsletter, Kathleen, that Tom seems to think? I mean, it seems, Tom, that what you were saying, the newsletter's key to you getting reviews and building your readership as well.
Yes.
I just started with a newsletter and a blog. And of course, I have several websites, and I'm kind of focusing one much more on my fiction writing now. But the newsletter is a new thing, and I've been working with Mail Aligned and doing a weekly newsletter, and I use a Story Origin where we're doing some of the giveaways and the swaps, and that's really built up my newsletter quickly.
What about you, Leo? Does any or all of this ring true, what Tom and Kathleen have said?
A lot of echoes. A lot of echoes. I have a newsletter. I blog about once a week. Sometimes I'll skip a week, but it's relatively frequent, where I just give updates to the readership about what's going on with the books. Sometimes I'll mention an interesting film I've seen or something very non-literary, but I keep people informed and connected to my writing. That's a bit of soft marketing. And then obviously when it's book launch time, yeah, I go into slightly stronger sales mode, but nothing too heavy, because those who are going to respond tend to respond very quickly. It also means that most weeks I get emails from readers, which is just really nice. It's not the reason I do it, but it's nice to have an ongoing dialogue with people around the world who are enjoying your output. To tag back to one of your earlier questions, I think if you're interested in just writing, then you don't need to pay an editor to correct your words. If you want to sell books, then I can't see why you'd not want to have someone produce the best product possible in order for you to sell as many of your products as possible. And I think that's why we see a lot of the Kindle store. I don't want to pick on Kindle, but it is the biggest store on the planet, so it's an easy target, if you will, having so many books that either don't rank or are fundamentally unedited, because people wanted to write. And I genuinely understand that, because I made the same mistake. I published rubbish onto the internet, and I can only apologize for it. I seem to be doing most of my apologizing in the last hour. I hope. But everything since then, when I've seen my writing as not just something for me, which I'll share with other people, but something which is about me communicating to the world, I have sought to produce the best product. And I've relied, initially due to lack of funds, I relied on my own journalistic abilities to edit. So I used to edit magazines and newsletters. So I'm harsh with my own writing, and I'm aware of how grammar is structured, more or less. But I write in US English now, which is a challenge for me, because I wasn't brought up inside American English idioms and so on. So I've had to learn that craft. But nowadays, I'm not just about making money. I'm about making money out of good stories. But I have my eye on the fact that I want to produce the best product. So yes, I have a cover designer, because my original attempts at using Photoshop were entertaining for me, enjoyable few hours spent, but they were pretty rubbish covers. Pretty rubbish covers. You can find them in the archives in Goodreads. If you want to look, you can see the first few covers were mine, and they weren't great. They weren't rubbish. I mean, they look like pictures, but they weren't going to sell anything. And Melanie Underwood I work with, she's a brilliant editor. She is able to spot things that I don't. She's able to catch my poor US English when it turns up. And she also does lovely things like spotting holes in the plot. Two out of the things she's probably edited 6, 7, 8 of my novels. There were 2 of them where I'd read and reread, and everyone had read and reread, but it took her to be the backstop and go, no, they're already dead. Literally, I had a big character resurrected, and I hadn't spotted it. Which is why you have people read.
Plot hole.
Yeah, it was a minor character, but I'd obviously killed them off in a peak a little earlier on, and needed them to run through, go, oh, look out, there's the Greek armies are about to invade Poland or whatever, and I had to rewrite, and that's fine. I think that to me is good part of the process, to spot errors. I'd be more concerned if I didn't find any errors, because as Tom said, I published magazines and newsletters for about 10 years. As I say, I've written about 11 or so books. There hasn't been one thing that I've ever published, either by myself or with a huge team, that hasn't contained errors. I haven't read a single newspaper or book of anybody else's production that hasn't contained errors. It's
inevitable, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the trick is just you have to accept that that you won't be perfect, and also accept the fact that you've got to try.
Yeah, I mean, one of the good things about self-publishing is that if someone does report an error, you can very quickly fix it, can't you?
Absolutely. Less than, you can take, in half an hour, you can go from, ooh, there's an error, to having uploaded the changes into the various sites. With
ebooks, of course, you can't do it with unless they're print-on-demand print books. Leo, just before we move on, you mentioned you're writing in American English now. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do that? Is it just because that's the biggest market is the US?
It was 2 things. It was that when I started taking this more seriously and trying to work out what I actually needed to do to have some level of success, I realized that the biggest ebook market was the US. And I also saw what happened when I tried publishing in UK English into that marketplace. People were telling me that I was spelling things incorrectly. And I knew I wasn't, because I know how to spell colour. I really do. It has a U. That's it.
I
But
tend to agree with you, I think.
I knew you would. Don't know why. But at the same time, going back to what I said earlier on, if it's about producing a product, that's for your customers. So the fact that I know that a colour should have a U in it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. What matters to me is that my customers are happy seeing colour without a U, because it's
Yeah.
still the same story.
That's interesting. It's interesting. I know I'm conscious that we've taken up a lot of your time now. We're over an hour, so I think we should wind things down. Just before we go, is there anything any of you would like to sort of say, or either for the benefit of writers who are starting up in particular, or if you feel that you would like to tell people about something you're doing that you haven't had the chance to speak about, etc. Now's the chance.
I'd just like to say it's been a great panel, and I do have to cut out now because I have something else I have to do, but it's been great. Enjoyed meeting with all of you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Leo, Tom, anything else to say or before we go?
Yeah, I think what Leo was saying earlier, I've tried to give some advice to a few up and coming writers along the way, and hopefully it's been good advice. But I think having things like an editor and a cover designer and all that is important if your plan is to sell books to strangers. If say, your grandmother has a particularly inspirational life story and history, and you want to write that book and distribute it to your family, that's terrific. Maybe you don't need an editor for that because you're distributing it to your family and people who knew your grandmother or whatever. You're not putting it out there for strangers to buy. But once you do make that decision that I want to sell this book to strangers, then I think the expectation they're going to have is that if I'm giving you money for this book, it's a professional product.
Yeah, definitely. That's very good advice, I think.
Okay. I just have one thing, if I may.
Sure.
In terms of advice, I think if you are thinking about writing a story, then just start writing the story.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it, because the first one's going to be likely to be absolute rubbish. So you can get it out of your system and then work on your second one. When you finish the second one, work on your third one. But if after one you're done, then hooray, you've actually achieved your goal, which was to write the story that you wanted. Thinking about and talking about doing something is a great way not to achieve anything. So if you think there's a story inside you, write it. You can always improve upon it later on if you like, or leave it just on your computer forever. Both are valid depending what you're aiming for.
I have to say, Leo, I completely agree with you. I've spent years and years and years talking about writing something, and only recently have actually started writing the thing I was talking about.
Anyway, read a book years ago that says writers write and everyone else just talks about it.
Yeah, that's a very good note. On that note, I think we should end. So thank you very much, Leo. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Kathleen. I think she had to run off, but this has been really interesting, and I much appreciate your time and advice that you've shared very generously. And and it's great to meet you.
You too.
And I look forward to reading some of your stuff now. I didn't have a chance before this panel, but I'll definitely get hold of it and start reading it. So look forward to that, and recommend everyone else do the same.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye now.